At the bridal shower, standing in front of 12 women in designer dresses, the maid of honor held up my second-hand bridesmaid gown, the one I'd altered myself because I couldn't afford the $400 version everyone else bought new, and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Well, at least it matches her budget." Everyone laughed. The bride laughed. I smiled and said nothing, because that's what I'd been doing for 11 years in that friend group, smiling and saying nothing while they laughed at exactly how much less I had than they did. What none of them knew was that in 3 weeks, I was going to walk into that wedding and show them precisely what my silence had actually been worth. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories about friendships, weddings, and the moment someone finally stops laughing along. My name is Grace Lawson, and this is the story of the wedding where I stopped being the poor bridesmaid everyone laughed at, and became the woman they never saw coming. I met Vanessa Pierce during our sophomore year of college, in a shared dorm suite that put the two of us together purely by the luck of a housing lottery. Vanessa came from money, real money, the kind where her parents paid her tuition in full without loans, where she drove a car nicer than anything I'd ever ridden in growing up, where spring break meant a trip somewhere warm and expensive while I worked shifts at the campus dining hall to help cover my own expenses. I came from a very different place. My mother raised my younger brother and me alone after my father left when I was 9, working 2 jobs for most of my childhood, and I got through college almost entirely on scholarships, grants, and the kind of relentless budgeting that becomes second nature when there's simply no other option. Despite the difference in our backgrounds, Vanessa and I became close that first year, close enough that by junior year, I was fully embedded in her friend group, a tight cluster of 5 other women, most of whom also came from considerable family money. Chloe Bennett, Madison Torres, Brooke Ellison, Sophie Whitfield, and Nicole Harmon rounded out the group, and over the years, I watched this friend group develop a particular culture around money that I slowly, painfully learned to navigate, or at least survive within. I want to be honest about something from the very beginning of this story, because I think it matters to understanding everything that came after. I loved these women, genuinely, for years. We had real history together, late nights studying, breakups we helped each other through, a genuine sense of sisterhood that existed alongside the financial gap that never fully closed between us. But somewhere along the way, almost without me noticing it happening in real time, that friendship developed an undercurrent that I spent over a decade quietly absorbing rather than confronting. The comments started small, in college, the kind of thing that felt almost like harmless teasing at the time. Vanessa would suggest a group trip to some upscale restaurant, and when I'd mention that it might be a little out of my budget, someone in the group, usually Brooke, would say something like, "Oh Grace, always so responsible with money, we love that about you," in a tone that managed to sound like a compliment while somehow also making clear that being careful with money was a slightly quaint, slightly amusing personality trait rather than a genuine, sometimes painful necessity. After college, the gap only widened, because while my friends moved into careers cushioned by family connections and, in some cases, family money that let them take unpaid internships or start businesses without real financial risk, I built my career the slow way. Starting as an entry-level bookkeeper at a small accounting firm, working my way up over years through genuine merit and long hours, because there was no safety net beneath me if I failed. By the time we were all in our late 20s, the financial gap between me and the rest of the group had become significant enough that it shaped almost every social decision the group made, vacations I couldn't join, dinners at restaurants I'd quietly suggest we reconsider, gift exchanges were my carefully chosen, budget-conscious presents sat next to genuinely extravagant gifts from everyone else. I stayed in that friend group for over a decade, I think, for a combination of reasons that I've had a lot of time to examine since everything that happened at Vanessa's wedding. Part of it was genuine love for these women, history that mattered to me even when the dynamic around money stung. Part of it, if I'm honest, was a kind of stubborn pride, a refusal to let my financial circumstances be the reason I lost friendships I valued. And part of it, the part I'm least proud of, was simply exhaustion, a slow accumulation of moments where speaking up about how a comment made me feel seemed like more effort, more social risk, than simply smiling through it and moving on. Vanessa got engaged to a man named Ryan Pierce about 2 years ago, a hedge fund analyst from a family with even more money than her own, and the engagement itself set off nearly 18 months of increasingly extravagant wedding planning that I watched unfold from the financial sidelines of that friend group. When Vanessa asked me to be a bridesmaid alongside Chloe, Madison, Brooke, Sophie, and Nicole, I said yes immediately, genuinely moved that she still considered me close enough, after everything, to want me standing beside her on her wedding day. Wedding day. I understood, going in, that being a bridesmaid in that particular friend group was going to be expensive. And I budgeted carefully for it months in advance, setting aside money from every paycheck specifically for wedding-related expenses, because I had learned, over a decade of friendship with these women, exactly how costly these events tended to become. The dress was the first real point of tension. Vanessa selected a designer bridesmaid gown that cost just over $400 per person, not including alterations, a price that the other 5 bridesmaids discussed casually in the group chat like it was a minor inconvenience rather than a genuinely significant expense. I did the math, quietly, against my own budget, and realized that between the dress, the shoes Vanessa specified, the bachelorette trip to a resort that was already being planned, and the various shower gifts and contributions expected of bridesmaids, I was looking at close to $2,000 in total costs for a wedding that was still 8 months away. I found a nearly identical dress, secondhand, through a wedding resale website, in the exact color and style Vanessa had specified, for $80, and spent an additional $40 having it professionally altered to fit me properly. I want to be clear that this wasn't a corner I cut carelessly. I researched extensively, made sure the fabric and cut would look correct in photos, made sure it would hold up to a full day of wear. I felt genuinely good about the decision, resourceful even, the kind of practical solution that had gotten me through most of my adult life. The bridal shower happened about 4 months before the wedding, hosted at Sophie's parents' lake house, an event that involved professional catering, a photo booth, and enough floral arrangements to fund a small business for a month. Partway through the afternoon, during a light-hearted getting ready segment where all 6 bridesmaids tried on our dresses together for photos, Chloe, who had appointed herself unofficial maid of honor energy even though Nicole held the actual title, held up my dress on its hanger, examining it with the kind of exaggerated scrutiny people use when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. She said, loud enough for the entire room of roughly 15 women to hear, "Wait, Grace, is this actually the same dress? It looks a little different." I explained, keeping my voice light, that I'd found a similar style secondhand and had it altered to match. Chloe held the dress up higher, turned it slightly, and said, with a small laugh that seemed to invite the rest of the room in on the joke, "Well, at least it matches her budget." The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough people, a wave of amused, knowing laughter that swept through that lake house living room in a matter of seconds. Vanessa laughed too, from across the room, not maliciously exactly, but easily, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has heard this particular joke about me enough times over the years that it no longer registers as anything worth questioning. I smiled. I said something self-deprecating and light, some version of, "Hey, gotta be resourceful," and the moment passed, the way these moments had always passed for 11 years, quickly, easily, without me ever fully processing, in real time, exactly how much that comment actually cost me internally. But something was different that day, something I didn't fully understand until I was driving home alone afterward, replaying the moment over and over. I realized, somewhere on that drive, that I had spent over a decade being the friend group's designated responsible one, their gentle punchline about money, and that I had never once, in 11 years, actually corrected the story they told about me, because on some level, I had let them believe that story was simply true, complete, the entire picture of who I was. Here is the part of this story I haven't told anyone outside my own household until now. and the part that changes everything about what happened next. 3 years before Vanessa's wedding, I had made a decision that none of my friends knew anything about. I had taken the money I'd been carefully saving since my first accounting job, invested it patiently and conservatively over almost a decade into a small portfolio I managed myself, alongside a modest inheritance from my grandmother that I'd never once mentioned to anyone in that friend group, specifically because I didn't want money to change how people treated me, an irony I now recognize given exactly how money, or the assumption of its absence, had already been shaping how they treated me. The entire time. That patient, quiet investing, combined with a promotion 2 years earlier to senior accountant at a firm that had gone on to be acquired by a larger company, stock options included, had put me in a financial position that none of my college friends had any idea about. I wasn't wealthy in the generational, family money way Vanessa and the others were. But I had, quietly and without anyone's knowledge, built a net worth that comfortably exceeded most of theirs, achieved entirely through my own discipline rather than inherited privilege, precisely the kind of achievement I had learned, over 11 years in that friend group, to keep completely invisible. I never mentioned any of this, not out of some elaborate plan for revenge, but because I had genuinely, for years, valued being seen for who I was rather than what I had, and because some defensive part of me suspected, correctly as it turned out, that revealing my actual financial position might change the dynamic of those friendships in ways I wasn't ready to test. The wedding itself took place at a vineyard estate about 2 hours outside the city, an event that, I later learned, cost Vanessa's parents just over $300,000 in total. The morning of the wedding, getting ready in the bridal suite with the other 5 bridesmaids, Brooke made a comment, apparently thinking she was being kind, about how she'd Venmo me for an extra portion of the shared bachelorette gift for Vanessa since she knew things had probably been tight this year. I hadn't asked for help. I hadn't mentioned anything about my finances at all. The assumption simply arrived, unprompted, the way it always had, built entirely on 11 years of a story I had never bothered to correct. That moment. The reception was where everything actually came to a head, in a way I genuinely hadn't planned but that unfolded almost naturally once the right conversation started. During the cocktail hour, I found myself talking with Ryan's business partner, a man named David Chen, who ran an investment fund that Ryan's firm frequently collaborated with. We started talking casually about work, and when he asked what I did, I told him, honestly, about my accounting background and, since the conversation had moved naturally into financial topics, mentioned the investment strategy I'd developed and managed myself over the past several years. David's entire demeanor shifted, genuine professional interest replacing polite small talk, and we ended up in a 20-minute conversation about portfolio diversification and long-term investment strategy that clearly impressed him enough that he asked, somewhat casually, if I'd ever consider consulting work for his fund's newer analysts, since my approach, self-taught and disciplined over a decade, was exactly the kind of practical experience his younger hires often lacked. I hadn't noticed that Vanessa, Chloe, and Brooke had drifted close enough to overhear most of that conversation until Vanessa turned to me afterward, her expression somewhere between confusion and genuine surprise, and asked, half joking but not entirely, "Wait, Grace, since when do you know anything about hedge funds?" I told her, simply and honestly, without any dramatic flourish, that I'd been managing my own investments for close to a decade, that I'd built a comfortable financial position through careful, patient work, and that I generally preferred not to make a big deal out of money, one way or the other, which was true, and had simply never occurred to any of them as a possibility, because the story they'd built about me, 11 years in the making, had never once left room for that particular truth. The reaction in that small circle was almost comically immediate. Chloe's face did something complicated, somewhere between embarrassment and recalculation. Brooke asked, a little too quickly, whether the second-hand dress thing had actually been more of a choice than a necessity, a question that told me she was already scrambling to rewrite the story in her own head in real time. I told her, honestly, that it had been both, a genuine budget decision years ago that I'd simply never updated anyone on, because frankly, nobody had ever asked me a real question about my finances in over a decade of jokes about them. I want to be clear that I didn't stand up at that reception and deliver some triumphant speech about how wrong everyone had been about me. That's not actually how the story ends, and I think it's important to be honest about that, because I've seen enough dramatized versions of stories like this to know that real life rarely hands you a clean, cinematic confrontation moment. What actually happened was quieter, and in some ways, more satisfying. The dynamic in that friend group simply, permanently shifted, in the weeks and months that followed the wedding, once the actual facts of my financial situation became known. Some of the shift was almost comically transparent. Brooke, in particular, became noticeably more careful about how she talked about money around me, less likely to make the easy jokes that had defined our friendship dynamic for over a decade. Chloe never directly apologized for the bridal shower comment, but she did, a few months later, at a group dinner, make a point of asking my opinion on a financial decision she was weighing, treating me, for what felt like the first time in years, as someone whose judgment on these matters actually carried weight rather than someone to be gently teased. Vanessa handled it the most gracefully of the entire group, to her credit. About a month after the wedding, once she and Ryan were back from their honeymoon, she called me directly and apologized, genuinely, for the bridal shower moment, telling me she'd thought about it a lot since finding out the fuller picture of my financial situation, and had realized, uncomfortably, that the joke had never actually been about my dress at all. It had been about a story the entire friend group had built about me over a decade, a story that let them feel generous and comfortable in their own wealth by positioning me as the group's charity case, regardless of whether that story was ever fully accurate. I appreciated that apology, genuinely, and I told her so. But I also told her something that I think mattered more than accepting the apology itself. I told her that the actual problem was never really about whether I had money or didn't have money. The problem was that for over a decade, none of them had ever actually asked me real questions about my life, my choices, my financial decisions, in a way that assumed I might have depth or agency they hadn't considered. They had simply built a comfortable, static story about me, the poor friend, the budget-conscious one, the resourceful one, and had never once revisited that story, even as the actual facts of my life quietly changed underneath it. I'm still friends with most of that group today, though the friendship looks different now than it did before Vanessa's wedding. Some of the ease of those old jokes has faded, replaced by something that feels, to me at least, more genuinely respectful, even if slightly less effortlessly comfortable. Brooke and I have actually grown closer since then, in an unexpected way, since she's asked me for real financial advice more than once over the past year, conversations that feel entirely different in tone from the casual money jokes that used to define our interactions. I don't regret keeping my finances private for all those years, even though I sometimes wonder how different those 11 years might have looked if I'd corrected the story earlier, spoken up the first time someone made a comment rather than letting it accumulate, joke after joke, into a decade-long pattern. But I also don't think the actual lesson of this story is about money at all, not really. I think the real lesson is about how easily we let people define us based on assumptions we never bothered to correct, and how much power there actually is in simply, calmly, letting the truth speak for itself when the right moment finally arrives, rather than spending years performing whatever role people have quietly assigned us. I wore that $80 second-hand dress in every photo from Vanessa's $300,000 wedding, and in every single one of those pictures, I look exactly as elegant, exactly as put together, exactly as much a part of that day as every other bridesmaid standing beside me in their $400 gowns. Nobody, looking at those photos now, would ever be able to tell which dress cost what, and I think, in the end, that's the most honest metaphor for this entire story that I could offer. The value people assign to things, and to people, often has very little to do with what those things or those people are actually worth, and everything to do with the story someone decided to tell, long before they ever bothered to ask if it was true. If you've ever had people misjudge you based on what they assumed about your circumstances, only to be proven completely wrong later, I want to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, make sure you subscribe to Betrayal Stories so you never miss the next one. We've got a lot more coming, and some of these stories hit even harder than this one did. See you in the next video.